Welcome to session 53 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This is an ongoing monthly series in which we discuss narrative universes that are quite rich, and we explore some philosophical themes. There's often a lot of discussion of the reception of the works and biography and a whole bunch of other stuff rolled into it as well. This time around, we are going to be looking at the first three books in the World of Tears series, assembled in this single volume here. Those are A Maker of Universes, The Gates of Creation, and A Private Cosmos. The World of Tears is one of Philip Jose Farmer's major series. You might also know him from the Day World series or from the River World series, but the World of Tears is in some ways the most influential of these. And there are two volumes in the series. There's actually another spin-off book that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. So we're going to be looking at these three earliest novels. You could say Behind the Walls of Terra deserves to be lumped in with these for reasons that we'll talk about in just a few minutes pertaining to his biography and the order of the writing. But we're going to go with two different sessions. Session 53 on this volume, session 54 on this volume next month. And you know, it's a progressive series. There's new ideas, new characters being introduced, so it works out quite well. There are a lot of philosophical themes involved in the World of Tears, and it turned out to be quite influential, not only on other sci-fi writing, but also on Dungeons and Dragons to a certain extent, and role-playing games as a result, on ideas that filtered into television. For example, you'll recognize a number of different themes within this series in Stargate, if you're into that narrative universe at all. And so there's a lot to say about Farmer's work. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into Farmer and particularly this series before we jump into talking about the development of the series and some biographical stuff, and then jumping into a lot of narrative universe and philosophical themes. So I first encountered Philip Jose Farmer as one of those cool sci-fi / fantasy writers that fit into what they call the new wave of science fiction that also included like Harlan Ellison and Ursula K. Le Guin, and I guess you could say Philip K. Dick fits in there, and Roger Zelazny and Michael Moorcock. And Farmer, as a middle schooler and high schooler, there's a lot of sex in Farmer's stories. As a matter of fact, he's very well known for being one of the people to bring sexuality and, in some cases, quite vivid sexual description into that genre, right? And so that was part of the interest. But he's also a great storyteller, right? And so I read some of the Riverworld series and some of his short stories, and then I actually checked out one of the World of Tears books from the library. I believe that I actually started with Behind the Walls of Terra, because I think Red Orc was already involved in it. And it was pretty cool. I enjoyed it. He's a storyteller. There's a fast pace to the narrative that's going on. There's a lot of cool ideas involved in it, especially for somebody who's a teenager. Not just the sexuality stuff, but all the other themes that we're going to talk about in a bit. And I read through some of them, but I didn't read through the entire series. Always wanted to go back to them. When I started doing the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, I considered actually doing World of Tears, but then I decided to do Riverworld instead because it was a bit better known at that time in you could say the internet world. And I remember enjoying the Riverworld and reading several of the volumes, but not having read my way all the way through it. So we did that, and that was either in year 1 or year 2. If you go back through the playlist, you can easily find it. And, I always thought, well, it'd be cool to go back to doing this series as well. And so my 50th birthday, I created an Amazon list because, 50 is kind of a big deal. And I do have a lot of fans and subscribers and supporters who wanted to get me something for my 50th. And I put these two books into my wish list. And I forget who got them for me, but I was really thankful that they did. And I read my way through them, back around September. It's now June, and so, now I'm going through my second full rereading of the series and enjoying it just as much this time around as I did the first, full reading of the series. So I think there's a lot to recommend these books. This is going to be a real treat to discuss them, and that's probably enough about my personal motivation. It would be quite interesting, those who are commenting on this video or involved in the live chat, if you have some interesting stories about how you got into Farmer and specifically this series, I'm sure I'd love to hear those stories as well coming from you. Now, let's pull the curtain back and start talking about some of the key ideas, about how the series developed, about what was going on with Farmer and what he envisioned as he started plotting and writing these out. Having already engaged in a pretty substantive biographical discussion of Philip Jose Farmer's works and life and thought, back when we did the session on the Riverworld books, I don't think I need to replicate that here, and I'd like to concentrate instead just on the Worlds of Tears series of works and, where the ideas came from and at what point in time they were percolating in Philip Jose Farmer's mind. And I think one of the books that's really helpful for this is Pearls from Peoria, which is this massive volume that includes a lot of his stories, but also includes a couple cool sections, one of which is, they're titled PJF, Philip Jose Farmer, on SF, sci-fi, and then PJF on PJF. And in the part called Maps and Spasms, he tells us a lot about his early life. And he tells us at a certain point, and this is almost at the 700-page level of the work, he says, in my senior year, so 1936, I discovered Dunazzi, and he so inspired me that I made notes and sketches for a story in which a single planet shaped like a Tower of Babel and having not quite Terran laws of gravity occupied the center of a parallel pocket universe. The only other celestial objects were a sun and a moon. An Amerind, that's what they at the time were calling Native Americans, named Kikaka, roamed this exotic planet and had many adventures. These scribblings and crude drawings were the basis for the World of Tears series. I didn't do anything about them until 1964, however. Notice, that's almost 30 years, right? Then the tiered planet universe became only one of many artificial worlds, and Kikaka became a Hoosier Caucasian, though with some Amerind genes, modeled on the type of person I sometimes think I'd like to be. Some people have noticed that the lords in the second of the series, Gates of Creation, have names out of William Blake. The reason for this will be revealed in the 6th or 7th final book in the series. So that's an interesting little bit of retrospective at that point in time, right? And Maps and Spasms is itself from 1981. So at the time that he's writing this, he's envisioning more World of Tears books than he's actually going to write. Now, you may be intrigued by this reference to William Blake, and we're going to talk about that a bit more later on if we have enough time, but I did want to jump into that right away. So he tells us several different things in a foreword to one of the collections of these novels. Not the edition that I have, but an earlier edition. And he actually tells us, too, the original title for this book was The Trapdoor Planets. For some reason, Don Wollheim, then editor of Ace Books, changed it to the bland and less meaningful The Gates of Creation. He also changed my title for the first novel to The Maker of Universes. When the third book came out, he changed my title, Kikaka's World, to A Private Cosmos. Son of a bitch, I thought. But there was nothing to do about it but complain again. And so those are the canonical titles that we now have. A little bit later, he says, when I wrote Maker of Universes, I did not have the origin and history of the lords in clear detail in my mind. What there is about them in Maker was made up while I was writing. But by the time I was ready to start on Gates, I had the genesis and the outline of the social, economic, psychological, scientific development of the lords in my head. I do not know what seized me to make the lords the same being that William Blake wrote of in his strange symbolical and didactic works. I had read parts of these works several years before, and I had read these and other parts in the early 1950s. At neither time had I thought of using anything from them, though they did stimulate me. Blake burns sometimes with an intense but opaque flame, and at others with a clear and mind-searing flame, and he has also very long stretches where the flame, if any, is hidden. My progress through them has been somewhat like the temporal locomotion of the Tempus Fugors in this book, although these are the creatures that jump ahead in time and backwards in time. Here, then there, then over that away, with plenty of disappearances between locale shifts. But while I was working out the outline of Gates, it came to me that the lords were actually those cosmogens the English poet knew. By knew, I meant knew. It seemed to me that he had not imagined them, that he had had personal relationships with them. And it also seemed that what Blake told us about them had been cast into poetic and symbolic terms for some good reason I hadn't figured out yet. Now I have figured it out. I also envision bringing in William Blake in the last book of the series, and perhaps having him make a brief and unaccountable appearance before the final volume as a teaser. I now wish that I'd thought of Blake's lords before I'd begun Makers. Yadowin or Wolfe would have had a different name, one taken from Blake. On the other hand, Yadowin does sound Blakean, so perhaps my unconscious, the she-demon named Abyssimus, was thinking about the poet and his works then. Urizen, Theotoromon, Palamabron, Rintra, Tharmas, Luva, what great rolling names. They sound partly ancient Greek, Homeric, and partly ancient Hebrew. Yet somehow they are neither, resonating in my mind anyway, as the names of beings more ancient than humankind, more distant than the stars in the skies, human yet not quite human, godlike assassin, assassin gods. So, we've got this really interesting framing staged at this point to talk about that. We should also mention, the timing of these works. So, there's the 1950s saw Farmer kind of struggling. He actually, I will mention this, not only did The Lovers come out and it was very controversial, he had the chance to become a professional writer. He's giving speeches at like Worldcon, becomes a technical writer. There's this Shasta Publishers who gives him a first prize for Oh the Flesh. And he's supposed to have an actual monetary prize. Shasta never actually pays it. He goes back to work but continues writing. And in 1965, same year that they moved to Beverly Hills, and not the good part of Beverly Hills, he starts working for McDonnell Douglas in California. The Maker of Universes will come out. And this is going to be an incredibly important work, particularly as we get to this notion of pocket universes and the sketch of the world of tears. The next year after that, The Gates of Creation, which is a very different kind of work, but set in the same narrative universe, is going to come out. Then we have A Private Cosmos in 1968. So the books are starting to space out a little more. In 1970, not only do they move back to Peoria, a place that Philip Jose Farmer wasn't born in, but grew up in. Peoria, Illinois, by the way, just south of here, right? He publishes Behind the Walls of Terra. He also that year publishes Lord of the Trees, The Mad Goblin, Lord Tiger, The Stone God, and The Stone God Awakens. And this is the year before a new series is going to emerge. To Your Scattered Bodies Go and The Fabulous Riverboat are going to get published in 1971. And there's a number of other great works that are being published by then. The next work in this series that's going to come out is The Lavalite World. So that's essentially book 5 in the series. Same year that The Dark Design in the River World series is coming out. And then there's more of these River World things coming out for quite a while, right? What's the next book in this series? Well, that's where we get to something kind of interesting. So there's a book called Red Orcs Rage. Now, Red Orc is a Blakean figure, but also a central antagonist within the World of Tears series, mentioned actually, I believe, in the second book, and then emerging as a character in the fourth book. Now, why Red Orcs Rage? Well, because Red Orc gets selected as one of the characters that's going to be focused on in Red Orcs Rage. And this comes out of a story. So Philip Jose Farmer, by this time, had 4 books out, right, within the series, and actually 5, to be, 5. The Lavalite World would be the 5th one. So there's a rich narrative universe. He found a psychiatrist who was using these books, these novels that he'd written, for therapy. He was having his patients take the characters within the books and do some role-playing and imagination stuff, and he, according to Farmer, actually had a pretty significant success rate. So Farmer said, wow, that's a great idea for a novel. I'm going to write that. Now, Red Orcs Rage, is it really part of the series, or is it a meta book about the series? You have to decide. And we may, in fact, do a spin-off session to talk about that after we get through the more canonical novels in this sequence. But he writes that book, and he publishes it in 1991. Then he's going to finally get around to finishing the series in 1993 with More Than Fire, which, I'll actually give you a little bit of a preview going to the very end of More Than Fire. This is Kikaka who's talking, right? It says, he would never again leave this world, the land area of which was larger than Earth's, to roam in it forever with Anana, one of the lords. By his side would be to live in heaven, though it would be unlike heaven in that it had a streak of hell and he could be killed. Ah, that gave it its savor. My world, he shouted. And while these words soared out over the planet, they were followed by a roar like a lion notifying everybody that this was his territory. Kikaka's world. Right? So he finally ends it with the very phrase that was supposed to characterize A Private Cosmos, Book 3 in this. And Kikaka really is, he becomes the most central character in ways that we'll talk about. Now, it's interesting that before he's actually neatly wrapped everything up, Farmer isn't quite sure how he's going to bring the series to a close. And so there's this great set of interviews with him, one of which is from his apocalyptic life, right? And the other is Sextifera, 2008. So we've got a 2008 interview and a 1990 interview. So let's look at the 2008 interview, right? Carlos Orsi Martino says, much of your sci-fi work, I may mention the World of Tears and Riverworld series, seem to me to be more rationalization frames for wild adventure tales. It seems that you did plan some Tarzan or Doc Savage-esque adventure and then thought, all right, in which frame can these things be possible? And then the sci-fi worlds were built. Was the process something like this? In your mind, what comes first, the sci-fi frame or the swashbuckling? And Philip Jose Farmer says, the sci-fi frame, of course. So, the narrative universe is being generated. A little bit later in the interview, he says, when I read A Feast Unknown, I was kicked out of my feet. It's a postmodern before postmodernism, Tarantinesque before Quentin Tarantino, and quite a fine yarn, too. It seems to have come before its time. A little bit later in that, he says, why isn't there more of your work translated into film and comics? And Farmer says, a lot of my early ideas were too early for TV or movies at the time. They wanted the traditional sci-fi. I have no idea why it isn't used more now. And, we're not getting still a lot of things that could be, this could be easily turned into a streaming series, but it hasn't been yet. Same sort of problem with Riverworld as well. In the earlier interview from 1990, he's asked in Starlog magazine, did the World of Tears series come out of a dream? Farmer says, I'm glad you asked that. I thought of the original idea while I was still going to high school. Never did anything with it then. It was an artificial pocket universe in which there was one Babylonian-shaped planet. I don't know whether I thought it up and wrote it down or had a dream about it. Anyway, Kikaka was originally an American Indian, and he was going along the edge of the world there. He had all sorts of adventures, which I wrote down in a notebook, which I don't have anymore, but I never forgot the idea. So many years later, I incorporated it into the makers of universes, only this time, Kikaka was an American youth who came back from World War II, a Hoosier, same initials as mine, Paul Giannis Finnegan, or Kikaka is what I would like to be, but I'm not. Riverworld's Peter Yairus Frigate is more like I am, though I'm somewhere between the two, more closer to Frigate than Finnegan, unfortunately. I finally decided I would write the story, and I did. Now notice what he says here. It wasn't until the third novel, A Private Cosmos, that I got the idea of incorporating it into William Blake's didactic and symbolic work. I never said anything about the connection, but people who knew these works, and that there aren't too many, could tell from the names of some of the lords that they were derived from Blake. Then I started shaping the connections between them, which will be revealed in the last World of Tears series, which is also mentioned in Red Orcs Rage. Now, he's already got the names of the lords being used directly from Blake in The Gates of Creation, the second book. So did he misspeak there, or is it a matter of actually widening the use of Blakean ideas? Well, we have to decide that, right? Then Starlog asks him, again, 1990, right? So shortly after Red Orcs Rage, before the final book, what will the final World of Tears novel be called? Farmer says, it originally was The Garden of Evil, though I may write one before that. I think the next one will be Kikaka's World, and then The Garden of Evil, unless I decide to incorporate them and make one novel and just finish it. And so that is what he in fact did. He could have done a 7-book series, chose to do a 6-book series. You notice that the 2 volumes are a little bit different in length, right? This, all told, the 3 books in this volume are 544 pages. In this book, we're talking about little less than 100 pages, less than that, 443 pages, right? So the novels are, as often does happen with series, getting a bit longer and longer. But these are all still quite short. You can easily read your way through one of these in a day of just sitting and reading it, or 2. And the action is pretty fast-paced. Next, we should talk about what these novels themselves are, and we're going to concentrate just on the first 3 contained in here. We'll do a little bit of plot summary and talking about characters, and that will lead us naturally into talking about the narrative worlds that Philip Jose Farmer has created. I do want to read one more thing before we go, however, and this is something that Roger Zelazny actually had to say about A Private Cosmos. This is the introduction of the third book of the series. It says, "It all goes back to my childhood of about a year ago when I first read The Maker of Universes. I picked up Philip Jose Farmer's book with the green Gauguin sky and the gray Gauguin harpy podarga on the front to read a page or two before beginning any work on story of my own. I didn't do any writing that day. I finished reading the book and immediately dashed off to my local purveyor of paperbacks to locate the sequel, which I knew existed, The Gates of Creation. When I'd finished reading it the sunny morning and Saturday, and its Baltimore had gone away, and night filled the day all the way up to the top of the sky. The next thing I wrote was not my story, but a fan letter to Philip Jose Farmer. My intention was not to tell the man who'd written The Lovers and Fire in the Night and A Woman a Day that I thought these two new ones were the best things he'd ever done. If he'd done a painting, composed a piece of music, I couldn't compare them to his stories or even to each other. The two books I'd just finished reading were of the adventure romance sort, and I felt they were exceedingly good examples of the type. They're different from his other stories, styles, themes, different even from each other, and hence, as always, incomparable. I'd hoped there'd be a third one, and I was very pleased to learn that he was working on it. In other words, I looked forward for over a year to the book you are presently holding in your hands. In considering my own feelings to determine precisely what it was that caused me to be so taken by the two books, I found there's several reasons. So he says, I'm fascinated by the concept of physical immortality and the ills and benefits attendant thereto. So we're going to talk about that. Number two, the concept of pocket universe is a thing quite distinct as I see it from various parallel worlds notions. The idea of such universes, specifically created to serve the ends of powerful and intelligent beings, is a neat one. Here it allows for, among other things, the fascinating structure of the world of tears. And then he talks about the great characters, Kikaka almost stealing the first book from Wolfe, right? The second book is packed with miserable, scheming, wretched, base, low-down, mean, and nasty individuals who would cut one another's throat for the fun of it, but unfortunately have their lots cast together for a time. And he goes on, right? And he talks about, there's great passage from Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra that he brings up. He says, beyond this, what can I say about a particular Philip Jose Farmer story? Shakespeare said it better in Antony and Cleopatra. Lepidus says, what manner of thing is your crocodile? Anthony, it is shaped, sir, like itself, and it is broad as it hath breadth. It is just so high as it is, and moves with its own organs. It lives by that which nourishes it, and the elements once out of it, it transmigrates. Lepidus, what color is it of? Antony, of its own color, too. Lepidus, 'tis a strange serpent. Anthony, 'tis so, and the tears of it are wet. Zelazny goes on and he says, indeed, sir, they are. It is the skill that goes with the talent that makes them so. Each of its products are different, complete, unique, and this one is no exception. I rejoice that such a man as Philip Jose Farmer walks among us, writes there too. There aren't many like him, none I'd say, but read his story and see what I mean. When you look at Zelazny's own work, which is a prodigious body of work, and you think about probably his most important series, the Amber, starts out as a 5-book series, then there's another 5 books after that. Some of the ideas that are in these volumes are showing up, including, as Zelazny has said, one of the key themes of the great lord who is amnesiac and doesn't realize that he is of this squabbling family. So that's probably enough about that. Let's jump in and talk about the narrative universe and about what's happening in each of these 3 novels. Let's talk now about the narrative universe that is being worked out and revealed We'll talk about it in some respect as it spans the 6 different books, but we'll also focus primarily on what is being revealed in the first 3 books, Maker of Universes, Gates of Creation, A Private Cosmos in Volume 1, in part because there's some pretty cool revelations and ideas, especially when it comes to the idea of pocket universes, that we'll explore much more in the session in which we'll be exploring Volume 2, because there's a lot more exposition in Volume 2 about what's happening. What we do know about these pocket universes in Volume 1 is that you can reach them from the Earth, and one way you can do that is through these various gates, right? That's actually the main way. And there's a discussion very early on where Wolfe is talking with Kikaka, and Kikaka is talking about how he comes back from World War II with this kind of interesting silvery crescent, and this guy Vogt is trying to buy it from him, and he jacks the price up really high, and Vogt comes in, and here we go. Vogt is trying to take these the single half gate to get into the other gate. He's got a flashlight. It's beam caught Vanek stooping over in the middle of the living room. The silvery crescent one is in his hand. Then I saw the second crescent on the floor. Vanek had brought another with him. I'd caught him in the act of placing the 2 together to form a complete circle. I didn't know why he was doing it, but I found out a moment later. I told him to put his hands up. He did so, but lifted his foot to step into the circle. I told him not to move even a trifle or I'd shoot. He put one foot inside the circle anyway, so I fired. I shot over his head, and the slug went in the corner of the room. He backed up, and I walked across the room while he backed up towards the door. He was babbling like a maniac, threatening me in one breath, offering me $500,000 in the next. I thought I'd back him up against the door and then jab the 45 in his belly. He'd really talk then, spill his guts about the crescent. But as I followed him across the room, I stepped into the circle formed by the 2 crescents. He saw what I was doing and screamed at me not to. Too late then, he and the apartment disappeared, and I found myself still in the circle. Only it wasn't quite the same, and in this world, in the palace of the Lord, on top of the world. And so this is the workings of a gate, and that's the main way that people get from one pocket universe to another. There is also this horn that plays a major role, actually throughout the entire series, and it's not just a MacGuffin, it gets used a lot to open up junctures between worlds where there's the possibility of gates. Now, the next thing that Kikaka says is really interesting, and here's where Philip Jose Farmer is. You know, Kikaka represents him in a certain way, as he'd like to be, and notice what he's going to say. Kikaka said he might have gone into shock then, but he had avidly read fantasy and science fiction since the 4th grade of grammar school. The idea of parallel universes and devices for transition between them was familiar. He had been conditioned to accept such concepts. In fact, he half believed in them. Thus, he was flexible-minded enough to bend without breaking and then to bounce back. Although frightened, he was at the same time excited and curious. This is a very interesting passage involving a kind of self-referentiality, not just to Philip Jose Farmer as the author, but to his readership. He's telling us, he's signaling us, listen, I'm working with an idea that is not radically new, going from here to there through some kind of magical gate, the possibility of there being multiple universes. Notice that he doesn't say pocket universes there, which is going to come up later on, which is a somewhat different concept. But the idea of going from one world to the next in an instantaneous way, not involving travel across space, but going directly from one portal to another. Philip Jose Farmer is saying, if you've read your sci-fi and fantasy, from an early age, this is not a puzzling thing for you. And when it happens to you, you won't be driven mad by the shock. And so I think that's quite an interesting observation that he's weaving in there, right? And this is in a discussion between 2 of the main characters of the entire novel arc. So what happens? Well, we start out in Earth, and that is going to be one of the main locuses of the entire 6-book series, although it's not going to become a major locus until the 4th book. The 3rd book actually concludes with them saying, okay, we got to go to Earth now. And we're going to learn some cool things about Earth that I won't tell you right off the bat if you haven't read those. And the other places that are going to be particularly important are the World of Tears, the place where Wolfe finds himself going after he blows the horn and goes through the portal. We're going to explore that shortly. But in the 2nd book, we have another world, another pocket universe, in which there are planets, small planets circling a central planet, which was created by Wolfe's, Jadwin's father, and the father of so many of the other characters that we're going to encounter, who are part of these people called the Lords, right? So what we've got is book 1, we leave Earth and we come to the World of Tears. We get to explore it to a certain degree. We're kind of, rushing through the different tiers, and we'll talk about what we mean by tiers in a moment. Then the 2nd book involves Wolfe having to go to this other place, this other dimension, this other pocket universe, trying to find his wife, consort, whatever you want to call her, girlfriend, Chrysace, who is the one from the Iliad, and he winds up in essentially a trap that was created by his father, or maybe not, maybe by his sister Vala. And so that action is happening after the first novel. The 2nd novel is sequential. The 3rd novel is actually happening at the same time as the 2nd novel. And it's shifting emphasis away from Wolfe and these other lords to Kikaka, who's been introduced in the 1st, right? And who's a good friend of Wolfe. And another really important lord figure gets introduced there as well, who is kind of conventional at the start, but also very tough, very resilient, very smart, Anana, rather. And then we get a final, I won't read that little revelation just in case you haven't read the books about who the Lord of Earth actually is, because that's going to come in when we look at the 2nd series. And so we've got some really major main characters, all of whom are either lords or are human beings who possess extraordinary abilities, and it's hinted that perhaps they could be half-lords or something like that. And then we have a vast variety of human beings, none of whom end up being major characters in their own right, in part because the series is just not designed that way. There are some who play important roles for a short amount of time, but none who really span the entirety of the series. So what we've got in terms of setting is this incredibly imaginative world. We already talked about, the interview where Farmer says, well, I make the worlds and then I make things happen within them, right? So let's talk about this World of Tears just so you can wrap your head around it. If you haven't read it already, this will give you at least a guide. If you have read it, this will be refreshment. So this is just actually coming from the Wikipedia overview, right? The pocket universe in which the World of Tears is located contains only 3 astronomical objects. There is, and this is there are all these names, and they're almost all unpronounceable. Aleph Methbin, the Thoan name for the World of Tears. Thoan is another name for lords, right? A single moon orbiting the World of Tears, and a single tiny star also orbiting this. There's light coming in, but there isn't actually any sun in it. And here's a little excerpt from A Private Cosmos. The surface area on all levels of the planet, that is the horizontal area on the tops of the monoliths, equaled the surface area of the watery bodies of Earth. This made the land area more than that of Earth's. In addition, the habitable areas on the verticalities of the monoliths, we'll talk about what those are in a minute, were considerable. These probably equaled the land area of Earth's Africa. Moreover, there were immense subterranean territories, great caverns, and vast networks that ran under the earth everywhere. So what he's created is, in terms of just sheer spatiality, a cosmos in which the world contains much more space than our Earth. And why is it a world of tiers? Well, think of it like a layer cake, except instead of the cake having the layers all pressed on top of each other, you've got a layer, and then there's a monolith that goes up, a massive axis. And then you have the next layer on top of that, and then you have another monolith going up. And it goes from the very bottom level all the way up to the palace of the Lord at the very top. And there's 4, you could call them, levels that are not the Lord's level, in which human beings interact with each other, as well as with a lot of crazy animals, as we're going to find out. And so at the very bottom, there's Okeanos, which is in large part ocean. And it's a sort of Edenic kind of area. There's plenty of fruit growing, and nobody has to really work for a living, and you can get as drunk or high as you want to and screw whenever you want to, and people just kind of, sort of like the island of the lotus eaters in the Odyssey. And there's, human beings there, and there's also dryads, and there's zebra-rillas, sort of a gorilla that looks like a zebra stripe thing, all sorts of other cool things as well. And this is actually populated by people taken from ancient Greece around the time of the Trojan War. And some of them have been, just taken there, and their bodies have been modified to a certain extent. Some of them have been placed inside of animals. Their brains have been transposed into, all these other kinds of things. The next level up, which you reach by climbing this monolith, which the first one is called Thia Phaeawoid, right? Again, crazy names that farmer made up for these. Then you get to the American Indian, called in the book Amerind, which was just, a common use term at the time, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And this area is mostly land with, rivers and stuff like that as well, and a great trade route. And it's populated by people taken from North and Central America. So there's Aztec-like civilizations. There's civilizations that, bear strong resemblance to the Plains tribes. There's a bunch of other things going on as well. And we're going to find out in the third book, there's also some Vikings that got plopped down in a part of the area as well. Then, you climb up another monolith, and you get to Dracaland, which is, they're saying medieval Arthurian, but it's really more, it was knights taken from crusades against the heathens in the Baltic area that were plopped out and taken there, as well as some Jewish settlements as well. And it's it's quite interesting to see the transformations that are taking place here. And then finally, there's Atlantis. That's the 4th level. And, Rhadamanthus is supposed to be the king of that. That's more or less devastated by the time that we get to these stories in this book was a major civilization. Now it's been turned into ruins and jungle, in part because of the machinations of the Lord, who has taken over Yaduin's palace, or Jadwin, however it's supposed to be pronounced. And so there's monoliths with each of these, and if you climb the final monolith, which you don't necessarily have to do, there's a workaround that they find in the first book. The final monolith is Idaquizurus, right? Then you are in the palace of the Lord, and the lords are these incredibly ancient beings that look like us humans, but have augmented their abilities in many ways. Many of them have been living for, quite a few thousands of years. Their civilization has been around for a long time. As we're going to find out later on in the subsequent books, human beings were ultimately, generated by them. And the lords do whatever they want with their universes. They set them up in whatever way they want to. They can be great places, they can be terrible places, they pull people from other pocket universes or from Earth, which is exactly what Jadwin did when he was Lord. He took, people from ancient Greece, he took Native Americans, he took these Germans and just, plunked them down and allowed their civilizations to continue on in their own trajectory. He also filled up these lands with some interesting animals, some of which are animals that lived on Earth but have been extinct for quite a long time. For example, lions that are even bigger than the lions we know, bison that are even greater than the bison that we know. But he also did a lot of messing around with animals within the biolabs, right? So he could create new, interesting versions. In fact, later on in the story, we find out that the world of Barsum, Mars, in the Burroughs thing, is created on the moon, not with every one of the creatures, but at least with quite a few of them. And so, we've got this really interesting... you can't call it a civilization because it's actually a whole bunch of different civilizations pushed into each other, interacting with each other. And, Kikaka, who's been in this world for quite a long time, since the 40s actually, he has aliases on each of the levels, right? And he got in there kind of randomly, as we saw, and then assumed an existence that he really enjoyed in this world. So we've got these main characters, and we should talk about. So we've got Kikaka, who's a trickster figure, right? And who is daring and does all this cool stuff. And he's connected with Wolfe. He's the one who throws the horn to Wolfe in the first place. And in the first novel, Kikaka comes in, and then he's there at the end of the story, but he's not the main character. The main character is Wolfe, who turns out to be the Lord, who's just amnesiac. And we're going to explore that story trope in just a moment. In the second one, we're now in this other universe, and there are these planets orbiting a central planet. Each of them is set up in different ways. They're kind of kooky places, right? One is primarily a water world, and there are these floating islands that can also go into the sky, and there are gates to get from one of these to the other. Another is essentially a world of glass, where you have to move around with sucker pads or skates. That's what the native fauna have. And then there's yet another one which is covered with skin, I guess you could say. And so there are all these interesting worlds, and you move from one to the other with these gates, and ultimately they have to get to the final world where everything is going to play out, and the big puzzle will get solved. And in that second book, there are all sorts of brothers and sisters and cousins, the gates of creation. There are all sorts of other lords or thoans involved, most of whom are, kind of jerks. We're going to talk about that in a moment as well as one of the key themes. A few of which turn out to be unusual, like Vala, or turn out to be unusually beautiful and also deadly, or also turn out to be kind of reliable and decent, which only turns out to be one brother of Jadwin. And in the third book, we're back in the world of tears, and we get to see a lot more of what's going on each of these levels. The third book also introduces a really important plot point that is going to run into the fourth book as well. And that has to do with the Black Bellers. And this is the introduction of mechanical intelligence, or AI, in a very deadly way in the storyline. And it also brings together Kikaka and Anana, a lord, lady, I guess you could say, but lord in her own right, into this love story that's going on as well. So that gives you at least some idea about what's happening in the world, what the universe looks like, what it is that Philip Jose Farmer has created for us to think about, his literary playground, you might say. One interesting theme that I'd promised earlier that we'd get to in this session, which we don't have to devote an awful lot of time to, is that of the amnesiac person who has their identity revealed to them, and as it turns out, they are one of, in this case, a lord or thoan, one of the important people, right? And we know that this is an old trope that gets used prior to Farmer. We also know that Farmer himself influences people like Zelazny, who waxes poetic about how great this stuff is, and who has Corey or Corwin in the Chronicles of Amber. At first, not quite know who he is until his memory is restored through walking the pattern. So this is a very common theme, and it shows up. Well, at least it's set up early on in the work, just on page 8, right? He says, there had been times when it would have been easy to whine or weep. How many men could remember nothing before the age of 20? He thought it was 20, for the Wolfes who adopted him had said that he looked that age. He'd been discovered wandering in the hills of Kentucky near the Indiana border by Old Man Wolfe. He'd not known who he was or how he had come there. Kentucky, or even the United States of America, had been meaningless to him, as had all the English tongue. And then the Wolves take him in, notify the sheriff, and because it's World War I, it doesn't attract a lot of attention. The newspaper is full of that. And he says, worse than his lack of formal knowledge had been his ignorance of how to behave. Time and again he'd embarrassed or offended others. He'd suffered from the scornful or sometimes savage reaction of the hill folk, but had learned swiftly, and his willingness to work hard, plus his great strength in defending himself, had gained respect. In an amazingly quick time, as if he'd been relearning, he had studied and passed through grade in high school. Although he had lacked by many years the full time of attendance required, he'd taken and passed the entrance exams to the university with no trouble. There he'd begun his lifelong love affair with the classical languages. Most of all, he loved Greek, for it struck a chord within him. He felt at home with it. And so, he becomes a academic and goes on, and this is before he enters the world of tears, or rather re-enters it, as we're going to find out, because it is indeed his world. We get a little foreshadowing of this when he's talking with Elicopsis, right? And she tells this story, once a long time ago, I was one of his favorites, meaning the Lord's. Whenever he came down from the top of the world to visit here, he would spend much time with me. Chrysace and I were the ones he loved the most. Would you believe it? The others still hate us for it. That's why I'm so lonely. Not that being with the others is much help. And so Wolfe asks her, what did the Lord look like? And she says, from the neck down, he looked much like any tall, well-built man such as you. His face? Wolfe asked. I do not know. I could feel it, but I could not see it. A radiance from it blinded me. When he got close, I had to close my eyes. It was so bright. And, as it's going to turn out, that was Wolfe or Jadwin as the Lord. And towards the end of this first book, The Maker of Universes, we find that Wolfe is starting to put two and two together. He realizes at last who he is, in part through talking with another lord who they had prisoner for a while. And it's a bit dangerous because he and Kikaka are lined up with Podarg, who's the, harpy depicted on the cover, right? This very powerful half woman, half bird creature who was put into this body by Jadwin, the Lord, long ago, and who's trying to wreak revenge upon him, along with her great eagles as well, many of whom were originally human beings too. And so we get to this point where, here we go. There's a slip of the tongue, right? And he says, he and Kikaka had not wanted to reveal the identity of Abiru until later. Podarg hated the Lord so much that she would have killed him at once. Wolfe wanted to keep him alive because Vanix, if he did not try to betray them, could be valuable in the taking of the palace. And, Wolfe says, the old saying goes, you can't trust a lord. Podarg says, what did you say? And I repeat, who is Vanix? And, she doesn't know the name, but she's already getting quite suspicious about Wolfe. And, it goes on further. Wolfe says in a low voice to Kikaka, he was a traitor, but he did us a service. I meant to try the same trick, only I was going to use the horn. And he's pretending to, figure these things out. But actually, he's the Lord, you could say, not in disguise, although he is in disguise from Podarg, but he's now had his identity restored to him, but it's a somewhat different identity. So if we go on a little bit further, here we go. Jadwin, I did not recognize you until I saw you with the horn. I thought you looked familiar. I should have known, but it's been a long time. How long? It's been many centuries. He's talking with the Lord who took over his palace, or millennia, depending on the time scale. So we two old enemies face each other again, but this time you have no way out. You will die as Vanix died. And then Wolfe says, this is Wolfe's perspective, suddenly he was seized with a concern and sense of injustice. If Podarg should kill Arwur, the lord who'd taken over from Jadwin's place, she would not be killing the man who was responsible for her present state. It was he who had done that to her. It did not matter that Arwur would have done the same thing if he had been lord of this world at the time. On the other hand, he, Wolfe, was not to blame either. He was not the Lord Jadwin who had constructed this universe and then manipulated it so foully for so many of its creatures and abducted terrestrials. The attack of amnesia had been complete. It had wiped all of Jadwin from him and made him a blank page. Out of that blankness emerged a new man, Wolfe, one incapable of acting like Jadwin or any of the other lords. And he was still Wolfe, except that he remembered what he had been. The thought made him sick and contrite and eager to make amends as best as he could. And so this is a really interesting conundrum, isn't it? There are other TV shows and movies and stories where people discover that they are in fact the bad guy, right? And that's what Wolfe himself has realized. He's at least not the bad guy, but a bad guy, and the one who so negatively affected all the people within his domain that perhaps he does deserve to suffer. But on the other hand, he's also the one who rallied them to, take back the palace of the Lord. So this is a very interesting thematic, and it really only has to do with Wolfe, but you could say that the reverberations of that run throughout the other books, in particular because in the second book, and it even affects the third and later books, Wolfe being the way that he is, as Jadwin / Wolfe, makes things possible for the other lords, possibilities that most of them don't take up, but could have. And so now we should turn to talking about the lords as a key theme. This class of the lords, at first introduced in the singular in The Maker of Universes, and then expanded into the plural in that same book as Kikaka helps Wolfe understand the situation and the universe that they're in, this theme is quite important, and there's a lot of different wrinkles to this that we can explore. But the first thing that I want to say is that there's clearly a problematic for the lords of what we can call the problem of immortality and power. They have great power compared to human beings and even in relation to each other. And they have to figure out what to do with that. But there's also this key theme of immortality. They take drugs, they have treatments that not only augment their bodily abilities, which are, pretty great to begin with, but can extend their lifetime indefinitely. And then the question is, well, what do you fill that time with? And how does that affect you as a person and your relationships? And this is a classic theme as well. Farmer, of course, is not coming up with this, but he's got a very interesting take on this. So we first start getting some exposition about this with Kikaka talking about the land that's and the Amerindia level of the tiers. He says, take a look at this. This level is not flat. It's got a series of slight curves. Those allow water to run off, creeks and rivers and lakes to form. There's no snow, but it rains every day. The clouds come in from space everywhere. So it's a pretty well-designed piece. And then Kikaka talks through Wolfe's turn at guard, and he said, and here's what we get from it. In the beginning, a long time ago, more than 20,000 years, the lords had dwelled in a universe parallel to Earth's. They were not known as the lords then. There were not very many of them at that time, for they were the survivor of a millennia-long struggle with another species. They numbered perhaps 10,000 in all. But what they lacked in quantity, they more than possessed in quality, Kikaka said. They had a science and technology that makes ours, Earth, look like the wisdom of Tasmanian aborigines. They were able to construct these private universes, and they did. At first, each universe was a sort of playground, a microcosmic country club for small groups. Then, as was inevitable, since these people were human beings, no matter how godlike in their powers, they quarreled. The feeling of property is as strong in them as in us. There was a struggle amongst them. I suppose there were also deaths from accident and suicide. Also, the isolation and loneliness of the lords made them megalomaniacs. Natural when you consider that each played the part of a little god and came to believe in his role. To compress an aeons-long story into a few words, the Lord who built this particular universe eventually found himself alone. Jadwin was his name, and he did not even have a mate of his own kind. He did not want one. Why should he share this world with an equal when he could be a Zeus with 1,000,000 or Europas with the loveliest of Ledas? And then he goes on a little bit further. And he says, the only trouble was the lords were not content to rule over just one universe. They began to covet the worlds of the others. And so the struggle was continued. They erected nearly impregnable defenses and conceived almost invincible offenses. The battle became a deadly game. This fatal play was inevitable. This is a very important point here. When you consider that boredom and ennui were enemies the lords could not keep away. When you are near omnipotent and your creatures too lowly and weak to interest you forever, what thrill is there besides risking your immortality against another immortal? And so this is a really key aspect. It's not just hatred, it's not just envy or rivalry or things like that. There is, you could say, almost an existential need for at least many of the lords to face off against each other, because otherwise the mere pleasure-seeking and domination of their, playthings, human beings, other animals, it falls short. Even the capacity to build weird new universes after a while isn't giving them the charge that they need. Some of them do kill themselves. Others, as we're going to find, devote themselves to furthering that science. But what we find is that the lords that we're dealing with here are in some ways, you could say, degenerate. They don't have everything that the lords in the past did. And so this is kind of an important issue, right? So the lords themselves, as we see very much in the second book, Gates of Creation, they don't know what to do with themselves when they're not within their domains. And some of them seem to lose any sense of purpose or ambition altogether. So they have a civilization, but their civilization is such that the lords now, the lords of the present, they can't actually develop anything new. All they can do is take the old stuff that they already had and reconfigure it. They can use the machines, they can use the technology, but they don't understand the technology. And so they're in many ways a declining civilization. When we go on to the lords as we find them, we get that they actually have some sort of connection with Blake. There's something going on that connected them with him and with all these crazy names. And there's sort of Philip Jose Farmer inserts this really interesting idea that Blake himself had encountered that particular family of lords, meaning Wolfe, Jodwin's brothers and sisters and cousins, and mother and father and all that, and reproduce that in his own works. A theory that we find just Farmer putting forth. So his narrative characters are in this narrative universe supposed to be the blueprints for a real life mystic, Blake, right? So that's kind of an interesting feature as well. But what's really important with this is that the lords themselves, as a family, this particular clan, we could say, they basically can't get along, and they're ready to kill each other, including Vala in particular, who is very dangerous, turns out to be masterminding the terrors and traps and tricks and puzzles that they have to go through. Vala actually at one point says, "Enough of this childish bickering. Don't you know that when you quarrel amongst yourselves, you delight the heart of our Father? He would love to see you tear each other apart." And so they're only able to have like a pact against their father because they all hate him so much and they're so angry with him. And then Wolfe says, "Vala is right. You call yourself lords, makers and rulers of entire universes, yet you behave like spoiled and evil brats. If you hate each other, remember that the one who taught you this horrible hatred and who now has set the stage for your death still lives. He must die. If we have to die ourselves in making sure of his death, so be it. But at least try to live with dignity, and so dignify your deaths." And, this actually provokes a counter-response from one of his brothers who calls him a foundling. And in a way, Wolfe is actually a foundling because he's a foundling to the Wolves. And he is, through that, bringing a very different perspective to these, the possibilities for these lords. So one of the questions that we can ask that I think is well worth delving into is, can a lord genuinely love? And we know that Wolfe, for example, loves Chrysias, and he loves Kikaka as well, right? So that's clearly true, but can other lords love? And there's an interesting point that gets brought up. Particularly from this one brother, Luva, who in Blake's cosmology is connected with love, right? And here's where you see Wolfe and his one brother that he gets along with working out their relationship. He says, "You were always too impetuous, brother, too rash, yet I feel honored you would forsake your safety to visit me. Only I should have been much more careful, more sure that the messenger was from you. At another time I might have been." And then Wolfe is silent for a while, and he says, "We're in the most desperate situation we've ever faced, Leva. The greatest peril, of course, is our father, but almost as deadly are those on whom we have to depend most. Despite their word of honor," this is his other brothers and sister, "they will always need watching. I propose we support each other. When I sleep, you watch. When you sleep, I stand guard." Leva smiled one-sidedly and said, "And when you sleep, you will keep one eye open to watch me, eh, brother?" Wolfe frowned, and Leva said hastily, "Don't be angry, Yadwin. You and I have managed to survive so long because we never fully gave our trust, with the best of reasons. How sad it is that all of us, our sisters, brothers, and cousins, once lived and studied and played together in innocence and even love." So love was there originally. Love could take place again. He says, "Yet today we are as hungry wolves at each other's throats. And why, I ask you, why? I will tell you. It is because the lords are mad. They think they are gods, when all the time they are only human beings, really no better than these savages here. Only they happen to be heir to a great power, science and technology, which they use without understanding the principles behind it. They are as evil children with toys that create whole worlds and destroy whole worlds. The great and wise men who devised the toys have long since died. Knowledge and science have died out. And the good inherent in the cosmic powers is twisted for their benefit and theirs only." And then Wolfe says, "I know that well, brother. Better than you, perhaps, since I was once as selfish and vicious as those others. Yet I underwent an experience which I will tell you about sometime. It changed me into a human being. I hope into a being only you have the ability to appreciate." And so this is a very interesting exchange between the two, right? It's telling us more about the culture of the lords. It's telling us more about what we could say Farmer is casting as the way forward for the lords, who generally can't recognize it. They view trust, they view love, they view long-term relationships that are not just based on self-interest and a kind of paranoia as foolishness. And Vala is a prime example of that, Wolfe's sister, and sister to many of the other lords in that book, who turns out to have orchestrated the entire thing. It wasn't their father who did it. Their father is prisoner, and she is the one who brought them all in there to torture them over, months and maybe even years, and ultimately kill all of them. So that's another interesting feature, is it not? And then in the third book, right, in the Private Cosmos, we get a very different kind of relationship developing. We have Anana, right? Anana, who is, it's always tripping up with her name, who, by the way, Podarg's face was modeled after, so that produces some interesting exchanges between the two of them. She is a lord who is, coming into Jadwin or Wolfe's world, the world of tears, along with two other lords, in order to escape the Black Bellers that we'll talk about subsequently. And she runs into Kikaka. They wind up being together for a while. She expresses the possibility that, she could be attracted to him. He's not quite sure what to make of that. She's clearly a dangerous person herself. She also has a kind of elitist, racist attitude and uses a slur word for human beings to describe Kikaka. And he tells her, if you do that again, I'm going to kill you. And over time, they come to trust each other, and then to appreciate each other, and then to love each other, to desire each other, to desire the love from the other one. And it's really only confirmed towards the end when Kikaka is going through this cyclical gate, and Anana jumps in and tries to save him, even though she doesn't have to, and it's at great risk to herself. She does so kind of spontaneously. By the very end, they are lovers. They will remain lovers throughout the rest of the books as well, which is kind of a cool feature. And, she justifies it to herself by saying, maybe you're actually the child of a lord. You seem pretty, with it. You've got all this strength, all these abilities, and things like that. So that provides her with a way of justifying it. But she does, in fact, fall in love, and not so much in this book itself, but in the other books, becomes a better person and a better lord through that. So, I think that is a kind of interesting arc that Farmer is building into this story. By the way, I will mention one last thing when it comes to the love thing, and then we'll talk about the Black Bellers. Farmer is known for graphic depictions of sexuality, the after effects of sexual acts, desire, what people have on their mind. And there's not, there's naked people in it, but there's not an awful, and there is sex, people do have sex in this, but there's not an awful lot of, semi-pornographic depictions as we saw in, the earlier Farmer, like with the lover, or things like that. In a way, he doesn't have to do that anymore, right? He can do and then they went off and, had a good time kind of dodges. And that's what, these various lords and their human companions end up doing. The last big philosophical theme that we're going to have time for here is to talk about the Black Bellers. And what we're talking about there is really technology, specifically something like an artificial intelligence gone amok and trying to eliminate, or rather colonize, the lords, and by doing so to take over all of the different pocket universes, and to rule over all the human beings as well. And they first come up, and all of this is in a private cosmos, and so they don't play any real role in the first two books. But the entire third book is dominated by that, and the fourth book is going to be pretty important as well. And so Anana brings up the Black Bellers. She suggests that maybe Jadwin was killed by them, and Kikaka says Black Bellers. Wolfe had spoken to them at one time, but briefly because their conversation had been interrupted. Later, he intended to ask him about that. And so, we don't really know that much about it. And Kikaka says, Anana called the Bright was one of Wolfe's sisters. He'd used her face as a model when he created Podarg's face in the biolab. Kikaka remembered now Wolfe had said the Black Bellers were to have been used partly as receptacles for memory. The Lords, knowing that even the complex human brain could not hold thousands of years of knowledge, had experimented with the transfer of memory. This could theoretically be transferred back to the human brain when needed or otherwise displayed exteriorly, right? So these Black Bellers are now, after them, and a little bit later on, we get some interesting exposition. As a matter of fact, the entirety of chapter 7 is almost taken up with that, right? So we're going to go through some of that. Anana says, let me see how to begin. The Black Bellers were originally an artificial form of life created by the Lord scientists 10,000 years ago. The scientists created the Bellers during their quest for a true immortality. So the idea was you would transfer your memories, essentially your entire brain, into the bell of the Black Bellers. And she says, a Beller is a bell-shaped black of indestructible material. Even if one were attached to a hydrogen bomb, the Beller would survive the fission. Or a Beller could be shot into the heart of a star and it would go unscathed for 1 billion years. So that's some pretty cool sci-fi right there, right? And he says the scientists originally constructed it so it was purely automatic. It had no mind of its own. It was a device only. Placed on a man's head, it detected the man's skin potential and automatically extruded 2 extremely thin but rigid needles. These bored through the skull and into the brain. Through the needles, the Beller could discharge the contents of a man's mind. It could uncoil the chains of giant protein molecules composing memory, and it could dissociate the complex neural patterns of the conscious and unconscious mind. And so Kikaka says, well, why would a Lord want that? What's that good for, right? Wouldn't the person be a tabula rasa? And Anana says, yeah, that person would. So the Lord in their body, their brain, is now basically a vegetable. But you've got the bell, and you can stick it on somebody else's head, somebody younger, somebody in better shape, somebody who isn't at the end of their body's life cycle, and you can re-inject that entire memory, personality, all the stuff, right? So you can download it, you could say, into the other person. And then you can live through them for another, 10,000 years or whatever. And this would allow lords to live on for millennia, perhaps millions of years, if no accidents, homicide, or suicide occurred, right? And she goes on and she says, the Bellers were to provide a means whereby the mental contents of the Lord could be transferred to the brain of a host. So, the Lord could live on in a new body while the old one died of its wounds. So the Beller was constructed so that mental contents of the Lord could be stored for a very long time if an emergency demanded this. It contained a power pack, and it drew on the neural energy of the host to charge the power pack. And then Kikaka brings up an interesting problem. He says, this isn't really survival of a person, though. This is kind of like the transporter issue in Star Trek, right? When you have yourself, whatever yourself is, could be a brain, could be your whole body, broken down, turned into another format, then reconstituted again, you've actually died, haven't you? And so, he goes on and he says, this stripping, dematricizing, scanning, and duplication doesn't seem to me to be a true immortality. It's not like pouring the mental contents of one head into another. It's not a genuine brain transference. It consists in reality of recording cerebral complexes, forebrain, and I suppose hindbrain too, to get the entire mind, or don't Bellers have unconsciouses, while destroying them, then running off the records, tapes, if you will, to build an identical brain in a different container. The brain of the second party, however, is not the brain of the first party. In reality, the first party is dead. And though the second party thinks that it's the first party, because it has the brain complex of the first party, it's only a duplication. And then Anna says, a baby speaks the wisdom of the ages. That would be true if there were no such thing as the psyche, or the soul as you humans call it. But the lords had indubitable proof that an extraspatial, extratemporal entity coeval with every sentient being exists. Even you humans have them. These duplicate the mental content of the body, or soma. Anyway, the psyche is the other half of the real person, and when the duplicate soma brain is built up in the beller, the psyche or soul transfers to the beller, and when the beller retransfers the mental contents to the new host, the psyche then goes to the new host. So that's an interesting way to get around this. This is also a theme that shows up, throughout the entirety of Philip Jose Farmer's Riverworld series, right? Where people who have lived on Earth throughout, from the beginning of time to, I think it's the 1980s or something, or maybe the 2000s, are all resurrected in new bodies that are, in the prime of life, and their souls are reattached to these bodies, or re-inhabit these bodies. This is exactly the same thing that he's talking about here. So that's a pretty important Farmerian theme, right? And it's not tied in with religious conceptions. It's really just sort of a physical thing that happens. Kikaka actually says, hey, do you have any proof of this? And she says, no, we don't have any direct proof. But, we've been assured the proofs existed at one time. Going on about the Bellers, Kikaka says, okay, so what, the Bellers are like former lords? And she says, no, here's where it gets complicated. Here's where it gets tricky. They came to realize, they started a new research program, essentially. Scientists accidentally discovered an unused bell had the potentialities for developing into an entity. That is, an unused bell was a baby beller. If it were talked to, played with, taught to speak, to identify, to develop its embryonic personality, it became not a thing, a mechanical device, but a person. A rather alien, peculiar person, but still a person. And he says, in other words, the framework for housing a human brain could become a brain in its own right. She says, yes, the scientists became fascinated. They made a separate project out of raising bellers. They found that a beller could become as complex as and as intelligent as an adult lord. The original project was abandoned. And she says, no one knows what really happened. There were 10,000 fully adult bellers in the project and a number of baby bellers. Somehow, a beller managed to get its needle antenna into the skull of a lord. It uncoiled, dematricized the lord's brain, then transferred itself into the host's brain. Thereafter, one by one, the other lords in the project were taken over. Possessed, in effect, right? Turned into, the tool, which has now become its own entity, takes over the tool maker and turns it into a host, and then replicates throughout the system. And she goes on, she says, at that time my ancestors were creating their private custom-made universes. They were indeed lords, gods, if there ever were any. The home universe continued to be the base for the stock population. Many of the bellers in the host bodies managed to get out of the home universe and into the private universes. By the time that the truth was discovered, it was impossible to know who had or who had not been taken over. There had been so many transfers. Almost 10,000 lords had been, as it was termed, belled. So there's a war that goes on 200 years, and she's born during that time. By then, now this is where we're getting some of the backstory that's telling us, how did these lords wind up being so screwed up, you know? How did they wind up in this situation where they got this amazing technology and nobody actually knows how to operate it? By then, most of the lords, scientists, and technicians had been killed. Over half the layman population was also dead. The home universe was ravaged. This was the beginning of the end of science and progress and the beginning of the solipsism of the lords. The survivors had much power and the devices and machines in their control, but the understanding of the principles behind the power and machines was lost. They managed to find all but 50 of the Bellers, and the 9,950 were placed into a special universe created for them. They couldn't find the other 50, and they created rings that Anana has to detect the Bellers, right? And she says somehow human beings must have come across the Bellers, and the whole thing started anew. And that's what gives us our plot points for the Bellers are taking over and possessing people in the world of tears, and they have to fight them. Eventually they kill all except for one who escapes, and guess where he escapes to, or it escapes to Earth. And so they say, let's get ready to go to Earth and find them. Here's a little exchange at the very end of the third book. Anana shakes her head and laughs. There's many things that a person did remember, things which a Beller could not possibly have known. He's my brother all the way through. He's not a Beller, and then they go on a little bit talking more about that. Where are we going to go to find it? Earth. We're going to have to go there and track down the Beller. And that's going to lead us into the next series. The Bellers are a, quite interesting antagonist. Are they artificial intelligences in the way that we typically think of it? Not quite, because, we usually think about like computers and, maybe linked together as like Skynet and the Terminator. But we think of solid state computers as the core of those artificial intelligences. Here, it's less of a computer and more a storage device itself that has sensorial capacities. The bells can actually sense some things. And the bells are, as Farmer has Anana say, the baby Bellers turn into entities, into persons, rather than just being mechanics. But they are mechanical, so how should we understand them? This is a very interesting question that is more or less left unresolved by the end of this. There will be a lot more speculation about all of these topics, and the topic that we didn't get into too much about pocket universes when we move into the next volume containing the 4th, 5th, and 6th book in this series.